I'm talking to filmmaker Ken Annakin. Thank you very much for taking time to talk with us, Ken.
Okay, well, it's a pleasure. I'm always happy to talk to Australians because it's a country that I've had a lot of fun in, and, well, I'm hoping that when my book comes out, So You Want to Be a Director, there'll be a lot of Australians wanting to read it. That's real plugging.
Ken, how did you become involved in the film profession?
Oddly enough, my first involvement was in Australia, and you won't be able to trace it back, I don't think, but I was a bum in Australia before the war in 1936-7. And I, for one reason or another, there was a guy called Oppenheimer riding a bike round Australia, and I thought, well, why shouldn't I ride a bike and see the things, various things? And on the way up to Brisbane, I ran into a film unit who were making a very early black and white film called Tall Timbers. The continuity girl was very pleasant. What really happened with me, I was riding down the path in the forest, and I suddenly heard a shout, "Get down!" And I got down, and then I went and saw them, and the continuity girl explained to me what had happened, and she was rather nice, and we got together a little bit, and I stayed with that unit for 3 weeks, seeing how film was made and driving a car, doing a stunt for them and that sort of thing. So that was the very beginnings in film. Other beginnings came during the war in England. I was in the fire service in Soho and started producing shows there, and then I was in the RAF, and I met with a guy called Ron Delderfield, who became a great writer, and we devised a show called Binbad the Airman. And then I was bombed in Liverpool, and when I came out, they decided that with all my adventures and background that I'd be better off in propaganda films. People were vanishing out of documentary films very fast, but working for the MOI, the Ministry of Information, and British Council, I was thrown into various chances, things, and within a year, I think I had learned most things that I had to do about editing and being an assistant and seeing how one told a story. And I made a picture called London 1942. And then I made 14 documentaries, and Sidney Box, who was my great guardian angel, who eventually came to Australia, by the way. I think they lived in Perth eventually, but he was running the documentary company, and then he went into features, and he said to me, look, if you can just show that you can handle actors as well as real people like documentary people, I'll give you a feature, because he got the job of running Gainsborough Pictures. And so I made a picture called British Criminal Justice, in which finally I had scenes in the Old Bailey with actors, and kept his word and gave me Holiday Camp. And Holiday Camp steered close to quite a bit of documentary filmmaking in a way. I mean, there really was a Butlins camp, and we really shot there. Then all the people were really very real people, but they were written characters. And then I went on from there, and I suppose I was making 2.5 to 3 pictures a year, like the Huggetts and Miranda. And
Actually, before we go into the Huggetts, you also worked with Carol Reed. Was that in the propaganda?
Yes, I worked with Carol Reed on an army training picture called, a recruiting picture called We Serve. Not In Which We Serve, We Serve. And I was on the camera then. The operator had been called up, and I was working a Mitchell camera. And after about the 4th day, Carol said, you know, Ken, listening to you and be around the camera, I think you ought to be on our side of the camera. And during that picture, we made a change. I photographed quite a bit, but I stayed on the camera on there, but I watched him very, very carefully in his methods. And I think from then on, as my various chances came, I directed very, very much on the lines, on the approach that Carol had. I think he was one of our great directors. He never pushed people, but eventually he got his own way, and that really is the secret of directing.
Yeah. I want to ask you a little bit about Miranda with Glynis Johns and Doogie Withers and John McCallum, who emigrated to Australia.
That film, of course, I took that over at 3 days' notice because Sydney had given an editor a chance to direct. He was making 28 pictures a year at Gainsborough, and so all sorts of people got their breaks. But this wasn't working out because his editor was shooting everything on wide angle, and that was silly on comedy of people like Miranda. So he asked me, as soon as I finished the flying picture that that I'd just done in France, he asked me if I would take that over. And I had 3 days to prepare it. And I said, okay, well, as long as you provide me with a car, which wasn't usually provided to directors in those days, so I could work and prepare my work on my trip from Shepperton to Islington, then I'll do my best. And I enjoyed that show tremendously. Googie was wonderful to work with, and of course Glynis Johns, I still see her here, she lives here, and we're very good friends. And I think one of her happiest memories is Miranda, although she and I did 8 films together after that.
Talking about the Huggetts, well, very successful. There were Here Come the Huggetts, Vote for Huggett, Huggetts Abroad. There were a lot of new people at the time that were in the Huggetts. For example, Petula Clark would have been very young Diana Dawes, Anthony Ewley. Did they just come through the casting process, or did you discover them, Ken?
I suppose I discovered them in a way. Diana Dawes, of course, we discovered for holiday camp. Diana Dawes had been a dance champion in Swindon, where she was born. And she came to us and did a wonderful job with the hokey cokey and other dances we did in holiday camp, and then we used her whenever we could in the Huggetts. Other people in the Huggetts, I think we saw on theatre. As a young director, one tried to go into the theatre as much as possible. You listened to what other people said about other actors, and you were able to give breaks to various. I mean, Tony Newley got his first break with me in one of those Huggett pictures. Diana Sheridan, who married John Davis, who was head of rank. I saw her only the other day. She was on the same plane as me as I came from England. She lives in Palm Desert. But we all worked together as a very happy team, and we didn't have big budgets. And of course I had Sidney's sister, Betty Box. She started in the feature business the same day as I did, and then he made her a producer, and I would think about 5 of the pictures I did at Islington were all under her aegis as producer. And we tried as faithfully as we could to keep to Sidney's budgets. And
successfully?
Well, we certainly never had any big disasters there. Shall we say, overspending happened in some of my later pictures, always with a conscience, but you know, you take Flying Machines. I went on shooting for 2 weeks after Fox had closed us down officially, because there were a whole mass of shots which didn't involve the cast, but involved funny aeroplanes and the aeroplanes doing funny things. But if you didn't have those, there was no picture. So I mean, I was saving their bacon when we insisted on carrying on. We just sort of put our shoulders up and turned our backs there and shot. The only thing was that when the rap party came, Fox refused to pay anything for us, and the writer Jack Davis and I and Margulies, the producer, we all had to fork out for the crew.
I hope it was a good party.
Oh, it was a good party, yeah. We put on a good show there.
Well, funnily enough, Ken, you've had the knack of making a film and then sequels follow.
Yes, sequels aren't always, as good as the first one. I suppose Monte Carlo or Bust was a sequel, intended to be a sequel to Flying Machines, because that was about old cars and the car race across Europe. I think it's quite a good picture, and it's got some very good trick stuff with cars that wasn't done with computers, it was all done real.
You had the fabulous scene-stealing Peter Cook and Dudley Moore.
Peter Cook and Dudley Moore. Dudley was absolutely wonderful to work with. They were both wonderful to work with. And, I mean, in a modern way, in that we would write the lines for them, but then you were quite happy if they slightly changed, fiddled them around, improvised, if it was funnier to them. And that's how you have to work with. Certainly every comedian I've worked with has a different approach. You take Terry Thomas, of course, always played the lines we wrote it, because whatever you did or whatever he said, Terry was always funny, a naturally funny man. And then you get people like Bourville, the French actor. He was funny as the organizer of the race in the Monte Carlo or Bust, but I had him also in The Longest Day. If you remember, as the landings are made, Lord Lovat and all the British commanders make a landing, and then they're suddenly going inland. Sean Connery and Norman Rossiter run into meet a guy who's dressed in a brass helmet, looks like a fireman, and is holding up a bottle of champagne, and he's there to greet them. And that was Bourville, who, as far as he could, was playing it as straight as he could. But there again, you had a comedian, and I've heard people complaining, French people complaining, that we allowed this supposed mayor of Colville to be a drunken clown. And I don't agree with it at all. If we'd really wanted to let him be a clown, he would have been very, very different.
Well, the French have a very different take on things, don't they?
Yes, and especially since it was, I think, a granddaughter of the family of the real mayor who said that he stayed in the town in order to greet them properly and all that sort of thing. I mean, whether it was true or not, there certainly was a figure who did appear like that. And Zanuck and Cornelius Ryan did the script of the thing. They were very right in taking this character, but because he, to my mind, he showed the whole humanity of people who had been sat on and hurt by the Germans, and here were the people coming to help them, and he was the wonderful breathing free. The champagne was the suggestion of, we welcome you, we're the best we can give.
One of my favourite comedians, and they used to show his show in Australia sometimes, was Stanley Baxter, and you did a series of films with Stanley Baxter, James Robertson Justice and Leslie Phillips, starting with VIP and then Crooks Anonymous and Fast Lady. Now, was Stanley Baxter sort of similar in working with Peter Cook and W. Moore? Did he do improvising?
He again was a wonderful comedian who could do anything you wanted. As you know, in VIP, in the prison camp, he plays two parts. He plays a part as one of the prisoners, and he also plays the German commander. And of course, in later television shows, he used to play every part. But no, Stanley Baxter, I think, was a great British comedian who was wonderful. French would have called him a mime, really, because he was wonderful at mimicking all types of characters that he felt, male or female. And of course he retired very early, and I think it was a great pity, but I think he decided that he'd done very well and he was going to get out while his reputation was still marvellous. And I don't blame him for that, but he was certainly a wonderful person to work with, and Leslie Phillips and James Robertson Justice, they worked with him wonderfully, and we had a great team there. I used to enjoy every day that we went out to shoot in those pictures.
And also, especially in Fast Lady, which I saw recently, was a very young and very beautiful Julie Christie.
Yeah, well, Julie, my daughter Jane, who eventually became a big agent in England, they were both at the Central School of Drama together. She was living with us, with my wife and I at that time, and she knew that I wanted an interesting, newish girl that wouldn't cost us a lot of money, and she said, well, Julie Christie's been doing some great shows at the Central School of Drama. And so I interviewed her, and she was great, but she knew nothing about filmmaking. And so I used to, by that time I had a driver, I used to drive out from Onslow Square every day, pick her up, and would give her the basis of filmmaking instruction in the car, shall we say, so that when we would mark out a scene, she would know what I was talking about, because she'd only been trained for theatre. And of course she did very, very well. She was charming, but of course after that she did some great pictures. Of course, probably David Lean's picture is still the best of all of them, Dr. Zhivago. But she, for a while, rather didn't give us much credit for doing the comedies, because she admitted she really wanted to be Sarah Bernhardt. She wanted to be playing dramas, or she wanted to be on the new wave, and she thought that we were doing, in making just entertainment, we weren't on the new wave and doing things that really mattered. On the other hand, I know that in various interviews she's done in recent years and in a book, she has said if she had really realized it at the time, she would have tried much harder and enjoyed working in these comedies much better.
Was she a serious young lady, was she?
She was, yeah, I didn't know she was, but she was a very, very modern girl who I think never knew where she was going to sleep, had everything in a handbag, and would land up at this person's or that person's. They would put her up, and I think we put her up once or twice. She was a modern girl of the 60s. I mean, I know when she was paid her first money, she bought the guy she was interested in a painting, because he was a painter. She bought a painting of him to try and help him. She was a very good woman, and I think the rest of her life she's shown that too.
You've worked with some other wonderful people. You did a film in 1950 called Double Confession with Peter Lorre. Now, he was a big Hollywood star at the time, and you shot that in England?
Yeah, we shot that at a place called Teddington. He was very, very interesting to work with. He would almost break into tears and go onto his knees if he felt that you weren't doing something that he wanted. And he was playing with an English actor, I've forgotten who the English actor was, who was a very good actor, but was very straight-laced, and who achieved his effects straight. And he was very worried by Peter Lorre and Peter Lorre's methods. And I remember that I had a very difficult time directing there, but learnt a lot from Peter Lorre.
What did you learn?
Well, I mean, I learnt that actors do have an original approach, and you're stupid if you don't give them... You should just lay out what you want and then try and draw from them as much as possible. I mean, a director these days, Mike Lee does that all the time. I mean, even to the extent of, I saw him in London, and he's starting his new picture. He's going to have this group with him for 3 months, first of all, without a written script, and then they will evolve a script. He will evolve on an idea. He will evolve a script that comes out of their experience of life. Very interesting. And shall we say, I learnt the halfway approach to that from people like Peter Lorre.
Film you shot in Australia, the pirate movie. Now, how was that experience, and how did you come to the project?
I came to it because they'd had a director that wasn't working out for them, and I got
an Australian director or an
Australian director. I've forgotten what his name was, but I think he'd only done TV, and the producer wasn't happy with him. The producers, because there were 2 producers on that picture. I got a call from David Anderson, who was my longest assistant, shall we say, who was working on it, and he said, "Look, Ken, they're in a real jam here. Would you like to come out and direct a comedy musical?" Gave me a rough idea of what it was. My wife and I were on a plane within 2 days. We just bought a new house at Malibu, but we left that and went straight off there.
Was this the first time you came back to Australia since before your cycling tour?
Yes, it was the first time. I'd been back to New Zealand because I made The Seekers, but I hadn't been back to Australia. And I went straight down to Melbourne, and we shot on the beaches near Melbourne, and then we came up to Sydney. I commanded a very old ship that was in the harbour there for about 4 days, complete command of this old windjammer, and I had a great deal of help there from someone you mentioned before, Ted Hamilton. Ted was the leading actor in the picture. He played the captain, and he was marvellous, and he did his best to try and get me the best Australian actors we could find, and for everything to go as smoothly as possible. I thought he was terrific, and as far as the picture goes, I think for some reason or another the writer, who had written a rather cynical script about HMS Pinafore, I think he took a dislike to somebody, and I believe he rather ran it down when it came to Australia. Here it did pretty well, and it's done well in television. Running it at one of my shows in England, the National Film Theatre, I've watched it and thought I would love to get my hands on it again and to edit it and shorten it, because there's some marvellous stuff in it, but it's far too loose. Somebody was saying, "Oh, you've done a lovely job," and that, of course, as you get older and people become a little bit more respectful of you, there's a danger that unless you have a very tough editor or a tough producer who really believes in himself and not just you, then that can happen, that the films overrun and they could do with a cutting.
Ken, we're just about out of time. I want you to mention your book, So You Want to Be a Director, and tell us what makes a good director.
Oh dear, what makes a good director? Well, I think knowing every bit of the job technically, so that you can judge what you should give time to and what you shouldn't give time to among your crew. You should realize it's a business in which everybody contributes. Everybody who is on that set or is on the stage with you, as well as the actors among the crew, they should all have a chance that if they see something that looks an interesting idea, not to be afraid to tell you. And eventually it's up to you to make the final decision. It's a cooperative career, that's something that we should all be very, very thankful that we have a chance to be in it. It gets very difficult with the money. Every film is different in that respect, and it doesn't get any easier as you get older. But I would say that if you know your job and you like actors and you give them their chance and you like a good story, which is entertainment, then you have every chance of being successful.
Thank you very much, Ken Annakin.
Okay, joy to talk to you, and I hope we talk again.